The Fed is concerned about inflation. They've made clear that they will be removing accommodation to try to get it under control. But I know they'll try to achieve a soft landing, and with some skill and some luck, we'll have a very good year for the U.S. economy in terms of the job market this coming year.
That, of course, was Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen talking to us at the very end of the week after those IMF and World Bank meetings in Washington. To go through what the Secretary had to say to us, we welcome now Steve Rattner. He's Chairman and CEO of Willett Advisors, which invests the personal and philanthropic funds of Michael Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of our parent company. So thank you so much for being back on Wall Street Week. Let's start with what we just heard from Janet Yellen. With some luck and some skill, we can get to what they call a soft landing. It's the thing that's replaced Goldilocks, I guess, in what we say every single day here. Square something up for me. How strong is the consumer? How strong is the household balance sheet? Is that enough to get us through the tightening we're looking at?
The consumer and the household balance sheets are still exceptionally strong. There's still over $2 trillion, I believe, at last count, of so-called excess savings above historic trends in the hands of households, roughly half from stimulus and other kinds of government assistance, and roughly half from money they couldn't spend during the pandemic. And that will certainly forestall a recession for a good while. I'm not at all in the camp of those who think that a recession is likely this year, or probably even the first half rather, of next year. But at some point, it becomes anybody's guess whether we'll get through this without a recession.
Well, anybody's guess, but square one thing for me, if you could, Steve. We have a lot of economists. We surveyed 72 economists here at Bloomberg that say after 2 years out or so, it looks like there really is a significant, not certain, but a significant chance. We also had Bank of America survey fund managers who say that's really a big concern of theirs. Why are they worried about it?
Because there's really, as Larry Summers has pointed out repeatedly on your show and elsewhere, history is not on the side of a soft landing. There's really no precedent for bringing an economy this overheated with inflation, whether it's transitory, permanent, or whatever, running at this rate down to anything that looks like 2% without there being a recession. It would require the skill of the most experienced pilot in the world to achieve that kind of a soft landing. You have to really cool off demand. You have to, unfortunately, raise the unemployment rate, get some slack into the labor market, and that's a level of precision that economics is sort of a science, but it's not that kind of a science.
So obviously the Fed has in its mandate price stability, and so it's sort of its primary responsibility of addressing the inflation that people are concerned about. At the same time, it's not necessarily all alone. There are other things that can be done. One of the other things I asked Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, about was why there weren't other things such as relieving some of the tariffs, the so-called Trump tariffs. This is what she said about that.
I think gas prices peaked and have now come down some from their peak. We're working very diligently on supply chain issues to get our ports working better. We're re-examining carefully our trade strategy with respect to China. And, I think it's worth considering. We certainly want to do what we can to address inflation.
So worth considering is what she said, Steve. I'm sure you saw that Peterson Institute report that came out this week that said if you took away those so-called Trump tariffs, it would reduce inflation as much as 1.3%, and that would not necessarily lead to a recession. So why aren't we doing it?
Because there are politics involved in all these kinds of things, and I shouldn't even demean it by saying politics. There are multiple considerations involved in all these things. We have a complicated, and I'm not here to say they shouldn't eliminate the tariffs. I think probably they should, but we do have a complicated relationship with China. There are many issues on the table. Maybe they weren't put in place in the most thoughtful way, but we do have a trade issue with China. So you could make an argument. But look, the administration is also doing things that actually increase the inflation problem. I think Larry has also pointed out on the show, but certainly other people have pointed out that extending the moratorium on student debt repayments, however meritorious and humane that may be for other reasons, does simply increase demand and therefore increases inflation as well. So there are always multiple considerations in all these decisions. But look, fundamentally, everything that Secretary Yellen said is very much at the margin. The core of the problem is that we have an overheated economy. The Fed went way too far. The fiscal policy went way too far. We're talking about trillions of dollars of excess fiscal policy, trillions of dollars of excess monetary stimulus. Tweaking a few tariffs here or there is not going to make up for the mistakes that have been made so far.
Steve, one of the other things that Secretary Yellen has talked about is making some changes in the entire international system by which we control the global economy, so-called Bretton Woods, both the agreements and the institutions. I asked her whether she really wanted to make some fundamental changes or whether it was more tweaking around the edges. This is part of what she said.
The world has changed in very significant ways, and I think that does require a rethink of the organization and some of the specific mandates that we give the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO.
So, Steve, how fundamentally should we be looking at these institutions? It is a very different world, not least because we have China now, a close second, increasingly perhaps taking over the United States in terms of a dominant position in the world, and it has a very different way of regulating its economy. Do we need to take a fresh look at things like the IMF?
Sure, it would be great. We're talking about, what, almost 75 years, almost exactly 75 years, I guess, since Bretton Woods and since all this was put in place. And so, for example, the IMF was created in part to help stabilize exchange rates in what everybody thought was going to be a fixed exchange rate world. Well, in August of 1971, all that changed, and we're obviously in a completely different exchange rate environment. And so there's absolutely no question that taking another look, whether it's a deep restructuring or some more modest changes in both those organizations, would be a good thing. I'm just not sure where you rank that on the list of priorities of things we have to deal with and the likelihood of getting international cooperation, especially from the Chinese, on some kind of dramatic rethinking of those two organizations. But you can't argue with her logic and her points on that.
Yeah, I want to pick up about the likelihood of getting it done that you just mentioned, because it's also a different world than it was after World War II, at least what I read about it. The United States was really in a very dominant position globally and could really, not perhaps have its way, but really had a large influence. It would be a very different matter today, in part because of China, as you suggest, but in general, it's a more evenly distributed world.
Oh, you're completely right about that. I should have said that myself. But if you go back to Bretton Woods, essentially, Britain was kind of, well, not exactly China, but Britain was trying to maintain its preeminence in the world financial order and have, if not the seat at the head of the table, at least right next to the head of the table. But it had no ability to actually enforce that or implement that. And so, amidst torturous negotiations led by Harry Dexter White, we eventually basically said it's going to be our way or the highway. And we got our way. You're absolutely right. We can't do that with respect to China or a number of other players in this world. And so it would have to be a far more consensual and therefore more difficult and therefore more improbable negotiation. Also, Bretton Woods was essentially, it was, like the old phrase, don't let a crisis go to waste. We had to do something at the end of World War II in terms of how the international monetary and economic order would work. There's not quite that same pressure today. So this, I think most people would look at as a nice to have, not a must have, and that also makes it a lot harder to get it done.
Yeah, not the same crisis, but we have a different crisis now because we have some autocracies up against some democracies.
Sure, sure. And a lot of what's going on in the world is a test of different forms of government and which one would prevail. And the Soviets were very difficult at Bretton Woods and eventually, I think, opted out of a bunch of the stuff or came in very reluctantly at the end. My history isn't quite that good. But it was difficult even then, and you can imagine what it would be like today with the Chinese. So, yeah, all of that makes it fairly improbable. And if I were the secretary, I think in the list of issues that we are facing, this would not be one that would be at the top.